In this clip I'm going to provide students with a broad overview on how to approach the exam, and for anyone interested, this is basically how I'm going to kick things off in my holiday exam lectures. So a cynic might say that I'm using this as a shameless plug, but I can assure you my motives are altruistic. Historically, what we've learned from recent psychology exams is that students tend to go about 50% better on the multi-choice component of the exam in comparison to the written part. A couple of reasons for this. There's a lot of straightforward questions on the multi-choice component of the exam, and yes, there are a few curly questions that tend to throw students out, but these questions are only a minority of the paper. But it's on the written part of the exam where we really spread students out in terms of the actual total marks achieved. This is largely due to lack of application and knowledge that's exposed on those written questions. Students lack detail, the key terminology when they're responding to questions. They fail to address the key criteria of the question, and that will basically be hopefully exposed when you're doing your practice exams. And finally, a lack of understanding of the content. And we'll touch on these, and I'll touch on these at length in my lectures should you come. There's another plug. Alright, in terms of, done a bit of analysis of last year's exam in terms of the command terms, and I've ranked how students did based on the nature of the question. And when they identify questions, students are good. They're good at identifying the correct response or using the appropriate terminology. But when you go down the list, at the bottom of that table, when students are defining, explaining, describing, etc., that's when we tend to lose major marks, and often students getting 0 out of 2, even though they might have a basic understanding of the concepts. They haven't used the key terminology. So something to be mindful of. You don't get extra marks for being verbose. Get to the point. Get the key words there. Make sure you've addressed the criteria. No need to waffle. You certainly don't get marks for repeating the question. Again, just get straight to the point, be succinct, get in those key words, use that key terminology, and don't go beyond the scope of the question. Just address the question. If you're asked to distinguish Brockers from Wernicke's, you don't need detailed explanations of each. You just need to come up with, let's say, 2 key ways in which they're different. Talk about location, frontal lobe versus temporal lobe, and talk about major functions, speech comprehension versus speech production. Look at the mark allocation. If it's a 1-mark question, only 1 point required. These are generally going to be your identify questions, and an identify means it probably is only going to be a 1 or 2 word response depending on the nature of the question. For 2-mark questions, you might only be required for a couple of words, maybe an explain, and then maybe the 2nd mark will be for linking your response back to the scenario. Now, most, if not all, of the short answer questions you're going to be given lines. It's basically 2 lines per mark. So if it's a 2-mark question, you'll get 4 lines. 3-mark questions, you'll get 6 lines. But that doesn't mean there's other ways you can't present your response, depending on the nature of the question. Dot points are great. So if it's a 3-mark question, come up with 3 dot points, and you're going to make it quite easy for the examiner to mark it that way. Like, for instance, when you're talking about the semantic network, you talk about hierarchical structure, you talk about the nodes, and you talk about the links. Diagrams are great, and sometimes they'll be appropriate. For instance, if you're explaining the forgetting curve, showing that rapid, then moderate, then minor rate of decline. For this serial position effect, have you got the primacy and the recency, or if there's delay, there is no recency. Again, drawing that graph to emphasize your understanding. And the semantic network theory, there was a question on last year's exam where students had to come up with examples. And again, the best way to do that is to actually draw a semantic network of concepts. Tables are great for compare and contrast or distinguish type questions, etc. So look out for these. Brockers versus Wernicke's, I've already talked about that. Certainly classical versus operant conditioning, there's a dot point on the exam. Maybe DSM versus ICD, or a discrete approach to the classification of a mental condition versus dimensional approach, etc. Throw in a table. The thing about that is you've got less chance of actually neglecting to fully distinguish between the 2 concepts. So tables are great, makes it easy to mark, and it shows, and it will just help you frame your response. So what do students lose marks for on the exam? Well, firstly, not reading the question properly, not noting some of the key points in the key command terms. So for instance, I had a student a few years ago who was asked for physiological symptoms of sleep deprivation, and she came up with a great response to psychological symptoms because she just misread the word, and that's common on exams, etc. Secondly, not addressing the key criteria of the question. So for instance, this question asking students to use the language of classical conditioning, explain how aversion therapy could be used to extinguish smoking. And the students just responded by actually sort of broadly explaining how aversion therapy works. But they haven't used the language. And whenever you get a question that's asking you to use the language of classical conditioning, that means you've got to identify the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, etc. So again, your solution will need to describe the process, identifying along the way the stimuli, neutral, unconditioned, and conditioned, as well as the unconditioned and conditioned response. So again, look out for those command terms. Language of classical conditioning, certainly got to identify the 5 elements. Linking questions, students are again traditionally poor on this. Explain how interference can affect the consolidation of memories. So the students sort of given an explanation of how the consolidation works, but they haven't really addressed how interference can affect consolidation. So what you need to do is you talk about interference, the causes of it, learning big hunks of information, similar in nature, close in time, which can interrupt the consolidation process, which requires a minimum of 30 minutes. Thus, the memory trace will be interfered with and won't fully form. Here's a question from last year showing a lack of understanding of the concepts. Patients got spatial neglect, which area of the cerebral cortex has been damaged. Well, most of the students got that. A lot of them got that anyway. Describe a symptom. Well, a lot of students, what they said was they said that students failed to see the left side of their environment. Well, that's wrong, because their actual eyes detect the light, the retinas will process the images, and that electrochemical message will be sent down to the visual cortex. But it's the internal radar system that's at fault, because it'll fail to attend or it'll ignore the left side of their environment. So when we talk about spatial neglect, we don't say failure to see, we say the failure to attend. And again, just be mindful of this. You will not lose marks on an exam for bad grammar. There are no marks allocated for grammar. You won't lose marks for incomplete sentences. In other words, dot points are fine. You won't lose marks for poorly structured sentences as long as you've basically addressed the guts of the question, the criteria. Simple spelling errors are okay as long as it doesn't change the meaning of the word. So if we spell Broca's area with a K, that's close enough. Okay, most people won't do that, of course. But what you do lose marks for is if the word changes meaning. So when we're talking about components of a neuron and we say the word axis when we mean axon, well, axis has got a totally different meaning to axon. So you're not going to get the mark for that.